Hello everyone, I'm Alexia Mouchet, a PhD student from the University of Munich in Germany, and I would like to present a project studying whether variation in exploration behavior could be maintained by selection varying spatially and temporally in graded populations. This is a collaborative project, so I would like to thank everyone for sharing and collecting the data. I would also like to thank the organizers and the judges for letting me presenting and selecting my project for this Ali competition. In nature, we observe a lot of variation among individuals in various phenotypic traits such as weaponry, morphology, color, and also behavior, both among and within populations. Variation in phenotypic traits, and here focus on behavior, among populations, let's say among 5 different gratis populations in Western Europe, could be due to differences in various ecological factors, such as climate, habitat type, food availability, predation risk, or population density, that could favor different behaviors. That is, that selection, the relationship between fitness and behavior, could differ among these populations, and thus different behavioral phenotypes could be maintained among these different populations. So, for example, if predation risk would be high in one population, shyer individuals could have higher fitness and thus be selected, while if in another population the predation risk would be low, older individuals would be selected. Thus, there would be macro-spatial variation in selection. The ecological factors could vary at a lower scale, that is, within a single population, and similarly, selection could vary among habitat patches in which individuals live, so that it could be negative in one habitat but positive in another habitat. So there would be micro-spatial variation in selection, and thus different behavioral types could be maintained within a single population. In addition to vary spatially, the ecological factors could vary temporally, and thus selection could vary, for example, across years, fluctuating from positive to negative. They could also vary both simultaneously, spatially and temporally. That is, that if we consider 2 habitat patches within a single year, selection patterns between those habitats could differ, and these patterns could change across years. So there would be micro-spatiotemporal variation in selection. Spatiotemporal variation could also happen at a larger scale, that is, among populations, where if we consider 2 different populations within a single year, the selection patterns could be different, and these patterns could change across years. So there would be micro-spatiotemporal variation in selection. Spatiotemporal variation in selection and phenotypic traits has already been shown. However, relatively few studies have looking into it for behavior, and what we don't know so far is the relative importance of variation in selection at the different spatiotemporal scales. So here we ask, how much does selection and behavior vary, and at which spatiotemporal level, and at which spatiotemporal level does selection vary the most, so that we can better characterize selection and know how behavior evolves. To answer these questions, we use data from 5 red tits populations monitored for 4 to 18 years and in 35 forest plots. We also have 188 unique combination of plot and years that allows us to estimate selection at a micro-spatiotemporal level. To estimate selection as a fitness metric, we use annual fitness, which is a combination of adult annual survival and the number of offspring that recruits in the population as a breeder in the next years. As behavior, we used exploration behavior, which is heritable and repeatable in graded populations. The exploration behavior is assayed using a novel environment test, where a bird is released in another room that we see on the picture, and the sum of movements that a bird does between perches makes it exploration score. Thus, a bird that moved more in the room is considered as more explorative, while a bird that moved less was considered as less explorative. And to estimate variation in selection, we estimated the relationship between annual fitness and exploration at the various spatiotemporal scale. And here is an example of the among population level. And if the relationship between annual fitness and exploration score is positive, that is the slope beta, or also called the selection gradient, is positive, it means that more explorative birds have a higher fitness, thus that they are selected. However, if the relationship is negative, thus that beta or the selection gradient is negative, it means that less explorative birds have higher fitness and others selected. And we found that there is variation in selection among populations, where in some populations selection was positive and in others it was negative. To better visualize this variation in selection, from now on, I will show the linear selection gradient, that is the slope beta, on the y-axis, and where the positive values mean that the more explorative birds are selected, while the negative values mean that less explorative birds are selected. And in the x-axis, there will be the various spatiotemporal scales, and here are the populations. And so we can see that in some populations, the more explorative birds are selected, while in other populations, the less explorative birds were selected. We also found that selection varied temporally. So now we have here on the x-axis different years in which the populations were monitored, and we can see that selection fluctuates from positive to negative within a single population. And if we compare the different populations and we focus on one single year, we can see that the selection patterns differ among these populations, where in some populations more explorative birds are favored, while in others less explorative birds are selected. Thus, there is a macro-spatiotemporal variation in selection. At the within population level, we found similar patterns with a spatial variation in selection with variation across plots. And so if we focus on one single population, we see that in some plots, the more explorative birds were favored, while in other plots, the less explorative birds were favored. And similarly, we found spatiotemporal variation in selection, that is, it fluctuated between negative and positive across plot and years. That is, that it differed across habitat patches within years and among years. Thus, from this study, we can conclude that selection on exploration behavior varied both spatially and temporally and at various scales. 2/3 of the variation in selection was at the among population level, and 1/3 of it was at the within population level, meaning that varying selection could maintain a variation in behavior at the within population level. And this study also showed that the selection varied both spatially and temporally simultaneously and within a single population, so showing the importance of estimating selection at a micro scale. We can also conclude that varying selection can maintain variation in behavior because we didn't find any evidence for directional selection favoring an extreme behavior, nor for stabilizing selection favoring an average behavior in the average population plot and year. That is, that there was no erosion of standing genetic variation. So the next exciting step now is to determine what are the ecological factors that induce variation in selection. Now, knowing that we should estimate measure these ecological factors at the micro scale, and also that it's good to estimate selection both spatially and temporally simultaneously. With this, I would like to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.